In the quiet city of Dnipropetrovsk, Ukraine, once a secretive hub for Soviet missile production, two teenage boys were growing up in a post-Soviet landscape filled with uncertainty, decay, and fractured identity. Viktor Sayenko and Igor Suprunyuk, born in 1988 and 1988 respectively, appeared unremarkable at first glance, just two young men raised amid the crumbling remains of Cold War industry. But behind their ordinary exteriors brewed a darkness that would eventually leave an indelible scar on the soul of a nation. Igor Suprunyuk was born on April 20, 1988. From an early age, he exuded control, detached, brooding, and unusually fascinated by violence. Raised in a relatively stable household, Igor's academic records were average, but his behavior became increasingly withdrawn and authoritarian. He often played the role of leader among his peers, especially when paired with Viktor Sayenko, a boy of quieter demeanor but equally disturbing tendencies. Viktor, born on March 1, 1988, was more introverted. Shorter and slighter than Igor, he often seemed like the submissive half of their deadly duo. Friends and acquaintances would later describe him as intelligent but emotionless, someone who could watch violence unfold without flinching. Both boys attended the same school in Dnipropetrovsk, where their bond deepened over a shared fascination with cruelty. By their early teens, they had begun to explore animal torture, a deeply troubling red flag in the psychology of future violent offenders. According to later psychiatric analyses, their early experimentation with killing stray animals, filming it and displaying the results to classmates, suggested a dangerous desensitization to suffering. This stage, experts say, is disturbingly common among young serial killers. Dr. Oleksandr Kachuk, a Ukrainian criminologist, stated in a 2009 interview, "What we saw in the Dnipropetrovsk case was not sudden. It followed a textbook progression, from power fantasies to torture and finally to murder. Despite these warning signs, neither Suprunyuk nor Sayenko faced serious intervention. Their families were not wealthy, but neither lived in extreme poverty. Instead, they existed in a gray zone, ignored by teachers, misunderstood by peers, and underestimated by authorities. The two boys began to isolate themselves further from society, building a twisted world of their own. Reports suggest they idolized figures who represented absolute control. Some even claimed they admired infamous dictators and studied serial killers obsessively online. What's especially chilling is how methodically they concealed their inner worlds. To the casual observer, they were simply young men growing up in a struggling Eastern European city. But within closed doors, they were crafting their own rules governed by dominance, power, and death." Suprunyuk, in particular, had begun to develop what experts would later call a God complex, viewing human life as insignificant, a toy to be broken for amusement. Sayenko, while less dominant, served as the loyal enabler, capturing their crimes on camera and assisting in planning. Together, they became what some later dubbed the Dnepropetrovsk Maniacs. By the time they reached 19, their transformation was complete. No longer mere outcasts or troubled youths, they had become predators, methodical, sadistic, and hungry for a twisted form of notoriety. In a country still reeling from economic instability and social fragmentation, these two young men would soon commit crimes so brutal, so senseless, that they would echo far beyond Ukraine's borders. But before their reign of terror began, they were simply Igor and Viktor, two boys whose lives were slowly consumed by something far darker than anyone had imagined. In the shadows of Igor Suprunyuk and Viktor Sayenko's dark alliance stood a lesser-known figure, Alexander Hanzha. Born in 1989, and also a resident of Dnipropetrovsk, Ukraine, Hanzha's role in the trio was less prominent but no less important in understanding how this deadly circle formed. Unlike Igor and Viktor, Alexander did not fit the mold of a sadistic killer, but his presence in their early crimes reveals how peer pressure, moral weakness, and proximity to evil can pull even ordinary individuals into unthinkable acts. Hanzha grew up in the same working-class neighborhoods as the other two, navigating the same post-Soviet confusion that left so many youths disillusioned and restless. He was the son of a metalworker and a grocery store clerk, raised in an environment where financial strain was constant and future prospects were dim. Teachers remembered him as quiet, somewhat socially awkward, but not overtly troubled. He didn't have a record of violence, and unlike Suprunyuk and Sayenko, he didn't show signs of pathological behavior in childhood. Yet, what he lacked in aggression, He made up for impassivity, a trait that would eventually make him susceptible to the manipulations of his more dominant peers. Alexander's connection to the duo began in high school. He wasn't as close to Igor as Viktor was, but he floated in their orbit, occasionally hanging out, playing video games, or riding bikes around the decaying industrial outskirts of Dnipropetrovsk. It was during these casual interactions that he was drawn deeper into their twisted inner world. According to court documents and psychological assessments, Igor and Viktor viewed Alexander as a useful follower, someone who wouldn't challenge their authority but could serve as an extra hand in their smaller criminal endeavors. The first sign of trouble emerged in early 2007, when the trio began engaging in petty crimes. Shoplifting, vandalism, and a series of animal killings that they documented on mobile phones. Hanzha's involvement in these acts, though not as enthusiastic, was still active. One notable incident occurred in spring 2007, when the boys reportedly tied a cat to a pole and beat it to death with a metal rod, recording the event as they laughed. Hanzha was present. He didn't stop them. He didn't speak out. He simply watched and sometimes helped, retreating into silence when questioned later. What drove him to stay? Experts like Ukrainian forensic psychologist Dr. Halina Kostyuk believe that Hanzha's role reflected a psychological phenomenon known as diffusion of responsibility, where individuals in a group feel less accountable for their actions. He may not have been a sadist, Dr. Kostyuk explained, but he was morally weak, and when surrounded by stronger, more dominant personalities, he surrendered his judgment to theirs. Still, there is a critical distinction to be made. Alexander Hanzha was not involved in the brutal murders that would later shock the world. He participated in robberies and acts of animal cruelty but distanced himself when Igor and Viktor escalated to human victims. It started with a whisper of death on the warm, unsuspecting streets of Dnipropetrovsk. The date was June 25, 2007. The sun had barely risen when 33-year-old Yekaterina Ilchenko, a chemistry teacher, stepped outside for what should have been a routine walk. Moments later, she was ambushed and struck in the face with a steel hammer. The brutality was instant, senseless, and fatal. Her body was discovered by a passerby not long after, her skull shattered, the scene soaked in quiet horror. Just an hour later, the killers, Igor Suprunyuk and Viktor Sayenko, struck again. Their second victim was Roman Tatarevich, a 45-year-old recently discharged from the hospital after undergoing cancer treatment. Still weak and hopeful for recovery, he never stood a chance. Beaten with the same ruthless efficiency, Roman died less than a mile from where Yekaterina had fallen. This wasn't random. It was deliberate. Calculated. Igor and Viktor had crossed a terrifying threshold, from fantasizing and practicing on animals to murdering people in cold blood. And it didn't stop there. Over the next 21 days, the pair would embark on one of the most savage killing sprees in modern Eastern European history, targeting the most vulnerable and unsuspecting members of society. In total, 21 lives were lost between June and July 2007, each death more vicious than the last. Their victims were not selected for revenge or gain. Instead, they were chosen for convenience, people who were alone, unarmed, and defenseless. Elderly women, teenagers, and even children. On July 7, 14-year-old Andrei Sidyuk was murdered while riding his bicycle. His body was found in a wooded area, his skull crushed and face unrecognizable. Days later, 48-year-old Natalia Mamerchuk, a mother of 3, was attacked while walking home after visiting her grandson. The killers used a metal rod and hammer, leaving her so mutilated that police initially had difficulty identifying the cause of death. And on July 12, 45-year-old Sergei Yatsenko, a retired factory worker and cancer survivor, was lured into the woods under the pretense of friendly conversation. What happened next would become a symbol of the case's horror. His slow, brutal murder was filmed in a sickening video later leaked to the internet, known as 3 Guys, 1 Hammer. In it, Igor and Viktor can be heard laughing and mocking their victim as they tortured him for nearly 13 minutes. The video shows Yatsenko lying on his back, groaning in agony as the young men strike him repeatedly in the face with a hammer wrapped in a plastic bag, likely to avoid fingerprints. A screwdriver is then plunged into his stomach and twisted as he gasps for air. His face is barely recognizable, his suffering drawn out, while Igor is heard laughing, taunting the dying man, as Viktor calmly records the entire ordeal. No effort is made to hide their identities, no remorse is shown. The men not only documented the act but reviewed it later, seemingly with pride. According to trial evidence, they stored at least 24 photos and several videos on their phones, some showing them posing beside their victims, giving thumbs-up signs as if celebrating a trophy kill. Ukrainian investigators were horrified by what they uncovered. Many officers required counseling after viewing the footage. The prosecutor on the case later remarked, "We have never seen anything like this before, not just the violence, but the coldness, the calculation, the utter lack of humanity." Forensic psychologists argued that the recordings served a dual purpose. They preserved the thrill for later enjoyment and offered proof of dominance, a twisted souvenir of death. What remains perhaps most chilling is that the killers never tried to hide these videos from each other. They filmed them not out of necessity, but because they wanted to remember. And in doing so, they left behind a digital legacy of terror that still haunts the internet, and the families of the victims, to this day. Authorities were baffled. The killings occurred in different areas of the city and countryside, with no clear motive or pattern aside from overwhelming violence. The brutality and randomness of the crimes sparked panic across Dnipropetrovsk. Parents kept children home from school. Streets emptied early. Police presence increased. Still, the murders continued. According to Ukrainian media reports at the time, fear gripped the region like a vice. Criminologists would later describe the spree as a textbook example of thrill killing. According to forensic psychologist Dr. Irina Karnakova, they weren't seeking money. They weren't seeking revenge. They were seeking power, dominance, and the rush that comes from watching life drain away. The killers photographed their victims, filmed the murders, and kept trophies. It was never about avoiding detection. It was about legacy, however twisted. By the time their spree ended in late July 2007, a haunting total of 21 victims had fallen, some never named in media, others remembered through faded photographs and grieving families. Dnipropetrovsk, once a quiet city in post-Soviet slumber, had become a nightmare, and at the center of it all stood two young men who treated murder not as a crime, but as a game. Police launched one of the most intense manhunts in Ukrainian history. Dozens of officers combed through forest paths, examined crime scenes, and tried to piece together a pattern that simply didn't exist. There were no known connections between the victims. No clear motives. No fingerprints or DNA. But the killers had made a single, crucial mistake, and it would become their undoing. On July 23, 2007, just days after the murder of Sergei Yatsenko, a break came in the investigation. Police were alerted to a suspicious transaction. A mobile phone belonging to one of the murder victims had just been sold at a local pawn shop. The device was traced back to Yatsenko, the man whose murder had been captured on video. Ukrainian authorities quickly accessed the pawn shop's CCTV footage and matched the face of the seller to 19-year-old Viktor Sayenko. It was a critical lead in an investigation that, until then, had felt like chasing ghosts. Surveillance teams began tracking Sayenko and his closest associate, Igor Suprunyuk. On July 23, within hours of tracing the phone, police arrested both Sayenko and Suprunyuk. A search of their homes revealed chilling evidence. Dozens of photographs of the victims, many taken moments after the murders, were found stored on their phones and computers. Even more horrifying, videos of the crimes themselves, complete with taunting, laughter, and methodical brutality, were uncovered. Among them was the infamous 3 guys 1 hammer clip, which prosecutors would later describe as the most disturbing piece of evidence ever presented in a Ukrainian courtroom. Further investigation linked the pair to at least 21 murders committed between June 25 and July 23. Shockingly, both young men showed little emotion during initial interrogations. Suprunyuk, in particular, displayed an eerie calmness, refusing to express remorse. One detective later recalled that he behaved like he was talking about a video game. Sayenko, though slightly more reserved, never denied his involvement. It became clear that they believed they were untouchable, that their crimes were beyond the grasp of law and morality. Adding to the puzzle was the third boy, Alexander Hanzha, who had been arrested separately on July 25. Although not directly involved in the murders, he confessed to assisting in robberies and acts of animal cruelty alongside the duo earlier that year. His cooperation with authorities provided key context for understanding the psychological dynamic between the three, and how easily he was manipulated into standing by as the darkness escalated. One of the final pieces of damning evidence came from forensic analysis of the murder weapons and clothing found hidden in a wooded area not far from the crime scenes. The weapons, blood-stained hammers and screwdrivers, matched the injuries sustained by several victims. Traces of human blood, DNA, and fibers from the victims' clothing were found on the tools and inside Igor's car, which had been used to transport the killers between murder sites. Ultimately, it wasn't sophisticated forensics or high-tech surveillance that brought them down, it was arrogance. The act of selling a victim's phone, as if it were nothing more than a discarded gadget, revealed not only their carelessness but also their complete lack of empathy. They didn't believe they would be caught. They didn't think anyone was watching. But someone was. And on that sweltering July day, the horrors they tried to keep hidden finally caught up with them. The trial of Viktor Sayenko and Igor Suprunyuk began on June 24, 2008, in the Dnipropetrovsk Regional Court. It wasn't just a courtroom that filled, it was a nation holding its breath. Families of the victims sat in silence, clutching photographs and memories, while the public watched with a mixture of horror and disbelief. The two young men, both just 19 at the time of the killings, were now facing charges for 21 counts of murder, along with animal cruelty, armed robbery, and the creation of graphic videos that would go on to scar viewers around the globe. Though they were dressed in civilian clothes, their presence was chilling. Suprunyuk often stared blankly at the judge. Sayenko occasionally smirked. The trial would last for months, with more than 100 witnesses called to testify and hundreds of pieces of evidence submitted, including the graphic video known as 3 Guys, 1 Hammer. Prosecutors presented a disturbing timeline of methodical, cold-blooded killings. Digital forensic experts testified about the phone videos and images stored by the killers, while investigators outlined the horrifying way in which victims were selected, at random, with no motive beyond the thrill of the kill. The court watched in silence as still images from the videos were shown. Families wept. One mother fainted. A courtroom psychologist assigned to the trial later described the evidence as psychologically scarring, and noted that some members of the jury had to step out due to emotional distress. The defense tried to argue that the men were not mentally stable, hoping for a psychiatric defense, but independent psychological evaluations found them both competent to stand trial. In fact, experts concluded they were fully aware of their actions, driven not by psychosis, but by a terrifying blend of sadism and boredom. On February 11, 2009, justice finally arrived. Igor Suprunyuk was sentenced to life in prison, while Viktor Sayenko received the same. The courtroom erupted, not in applause but in tears. For many, it was not closure but the beginning of a lifetime of unanswered questions. Alexander Hanzha, the third accomplice who did not participate in the murders but was involved in earlier robberies, was sentenced to 9 years in prison. His sentence, while less severe, still reflected the gravity of his participation in the group's early crimes. But what compels 2 young men, barely out of their teens, to trade their humanity for horror? How does a mind become so numb to suffering that it not only commits murder but records it with pride? These are the questions that linger long after the courtroom doors have closed and the headlines fade. In the case of Viktor Sayenko and Igor Suprunyuk, we're left staring into a psychological abyss, where there were no political motives, no cries for help, no mental illness to blame. Just cold, calculated violence. Could something have been done to stop them before the first life was taken? But perhaps the most terrifying question of all is this: could it happen again? Could someone like them be walking among us right now? They may not wear black cloaks or carry weapons in plain sight. They may sit next to us in class, pass us on the street, or live quietly next door. Are we prepared to recognize true darkness when it's not wrapped in cliches but dressed as normalcy? These are not just questions for psychologists or police, they're for all of us. In an age of social media, where validation comes in clicks and followers, where disturbing content is only a search away, are we nurturing empathy in our youth, or are we breeding numbness? And finally, how do we honor the victims, not just with justice, but with remembrance? Do we bury their stories beneath fear and discomfort, or do we bring them to light, refusing to let them vanish behind the names of those who took their lives? The Dnipropetrovsk case may be closed, but the conversation it demands is far from over. Evil may have faces, But so does courage, so does truth, and so does memory. What do you take away from this story? And how will it change the way you see the world around you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And as always, stay aware, stay compassionate, and never forget the names behind the silence.